A group of New York state legislators is pushing to close the state prison in Marcy after guards viciously beat inmate Robert Brooks, who died hours later. The beating was recorded on body cameras. Other inmates have accused guards at the Marcy Correctional Facility of severe, unprovoked beatings and say there's a culture of brutality in the New York prison system. The FBI and the state have opened criminal investigations. So, Ben, has New York turned a blind eye to systemic abuse in the system?
No, I don't. This isn't specific to New York. Dr. Zimbardo has been studying this since 1971. He infamously ran the Stanford experiment, prison experiment, I should say, which involved 24 white males, all from middle class, no criminal records, no psychological records, and it was a dumpster fire. Basically, what he has found over his years of study, because he's still studying it, saw it in Afghanistan, is that ordinary people can commit evil when placed in specific situational contexts where factors like power dynamics, dehumanization, and group pressures are all in place. And I think that's what we saw.
So this is a problem then in prisons all over, this sort of culture of brutality?
It can be a recipe for problems if one of those things are not addressed. In particular, dehumanization. That's a big one that you have control over, that you're treating them with respect because they are people. When you start treating other people like animals, and you hold them like that, you carry them, you talk to them like they're a thing rather than a human being, that's where the wheel falls off. So do I think it is specific to this prison? There have been reports in this prison, so there may be a cultural aspect that needs to be addressed, but more importantly, seeing other human beings as human beings is the number one thing.
So inmates say, Ty, that inmates there in Marcy, that there was a beat-up squad. So should that prison be closed as legislators want?
I have no idea. I mean, what I know about prisons is really, really small, but really little. But I do know that there's 52 facilities in the SUNY system, or in the correction system of New York, 17,000 employees, 30,000 incarcerated people. So I think they need to look at this in a holistic way. But 60% of the complaints that come to the New York IG, Inspector General, are about the prison. So I think the idea of having an overarching reform system, of looking at this, a commission to look overarchingly at this, would be the way to go. I agree, prisons are always going to be a problem. I can't think of a job that would be harder than being a prison guard. But I do think that we, at least in New York, we haven't privatized the prisons, which is what many southern states have done. Or they've done incredibly cruel things like making sure there's no air conditioning, which the Texas system does. But I think how we treated those who are incarcerated shows our humanity or our lack thereof.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think the idea of doing more investigations and stuff is useful, but not enough. I mean, there have been investigations, both at the state level, and the Department of Justice has looked at particularly terrible prison conditions in places like Alabama, which has some of the most violent prisons. And, you know, 10 years later, 5 years later, nothing has changed, right? So we need a system of accountability. And that's part of the problem, is this culture of silence and protection of other officers who engage in this kind of brutality. Their supervisors turn a blind eye. There's no punishment for them. I mean, if this hadn't been filmed and hadn't been released to the public, who knows what would have happened in this case? You know, they would have found some other reason for him dying, right? And so I think that we need a lot more than just more commissions looking into these issues. We need changes in how these officers, you know, if they lose their job as a result of these things, that could start to change things.
And Jenny, the governor has moved to fire 14 guards and a nurse, and I read just this morning 4 other guards as well.
Right. So this particular prison has a history. There were allegations of a very large beating that happened, 100 prisoners, 30 guards, about a couple years ago. No consequences came of that action. We see I think there's 4 other cases right now pending with different officers, including a couple involved in this most recent beating. So this particular prison seems to have an especially problematic history. It raises questions to me on kind of the larger supervisory and oversight by New York State of our prison systems. I was looking into the history of the kind of who's the current commissioner. They'd been in an acting position for the past year, only appointed as a permanent position in May. The prior commissioner had been in the position for 10 years. It says to me that the Hochul administration, that New York State is not doing a good job of overseeing the correctional system. Closing Marcy, I don't think is an option at the moment, in part because actually incarcerations are up 4% this last year. So while New York has reduced the number of prisons over the last 15 years, we probably need the current facility so we don't create overcrowding and other issues like that. But there has to be oversight. Just because you've been incarcerated for a crime does not mean that you potentially face beatings and death.
Yeah, and just real quick, I mean, obviously people that have watched the show know that I am the first to stand up and speak on behalf of law enforcement and correction. And in this case, this is an example of what a few do to tarnish what many do right. This is not representative of what's happening all the time in prisons. This is this may be an indicator of what's been occurring way too much in that prison, but it's not indicative of what typically happens in prisons.
But unless you have a system of accountability in the prison, you've got to
And
have
there
it,
is.
But you've got to have the professionals who are taking, when this bad things happen, how do you deal with those
Right,
bad
and they do have a system of internal affairs. But you're correct. Had he not passed away, unfortunately, this probably would not have been investigated.
If there hadn't been
due to the-
cameras,
And
that's I think the
cameras,
other big
or-
thing,
and if
that
he
was
hadn't
new.
died. And the other issue with violence is prisoner-on-prisoner violence, right? So it's not just that they're threatened by officers, which is true as well, but the officers often turn a blind eye to prisoner-on-prisoner violence and sexual assault.